A man is whipped in the village square for not paying his lord's taxes. A mother is burying a child who didn't survive the winter. And someone nearby is boiling grass for dinner because the grain ran out weeks ago. This isn't a disaster. This is your life. For most of the Middle Ages, you're a peasant. You work the land from sunrise to darkness, and most of what you grow is taken away anyway. And your day is about to begin. Very early, very hungry, and very, very badly. It's still dark. You're sleeping on a sack of straw that hasn't been changed in months. Something crawls across your arm. Probably fleas, probably lice. Either way, they live here now. You sit up slowly because your back already hurts. Yesterday, you spent nearly 12 hours bending over a wooden plow behind an ox that smells worse than the ditch outside your house. Breakfast is waiting. A small piece of black rye bread, maybe some thin ale. Meat is a feast for days, which happens a few times a year, if things go well. Most mornings, they don't. Bad harvests are common in medieval Europe. One wet summer or a cold spring and the grain dies. When that happens, people start eating whatever they find. Weeds, tree bark, grass. Some villages mixed sawdust into bread just to make it last longer. And the worst part? You still have to give a big portion of your harvest to the local lord as rent and tax. So even when food exists, you might not get to keep it. Which means every morning begins with the same quiet question. Will there be enough food to survive the winter? But hunger is only the beginning of your problems. Because now you have to go outside and start working. The sun isn't up yet, but you're already walking to the fields. Because if you're a medieval peasant, daylight means work. A lot of it. Your tools are simple. A wooden plow, a rough iron blade, maybe an ox if your family is lucky. Most of the time, you're digging, planting, and cutting crops by hand, hour after hour. The fields are wet, heavy, and full of rocks. Your hands blister, your back bends. By midday, your clothes are soaked with sweat and mud. And you keep going. 10 to 14 hours a day during planting and harvest seasons. If the crop fails, the entire village could starve. So everyone works. Children work. Old people work. Anyone who can stand is expected to help. But the real insult comes later. When the harvest finally comes in, much of it doesn't belong to you. You owe grain to the Lord who owns the land, more grain to the church as a tithe, sometimes extra taxes for wars you'll never see. After all that, what's left has to feed your entire family. So after months of breaking your body in the fields, the reward is simple. You still might go to bed hungry, and unfortunately, the day is far from over. After a full day in the fields, you finally go home. Home is a small wooden hut with a dirt floor and a roof made of straw. When it rains, the roof leaks. When it's cold, the wind slides through the cracks in the walls. And you're not alone in there. Fleas live in the straw bed, lice live in your hair, rats live in the corners. Chickens sometimes sleep inside the house because it's warmer. Hygiene isn't exactly a priority in the Middle Ages. Most peasants bathe only a few times a year. Waste is thrown into the street or dumped nearby. The smell alone would make a modern person pass out. But the real danger is disease. In cramped medieval villages, infections spread quickly. Dysentery, typhus, tuberculosis, and countless fevers move from house to house like bad weather. Children die the most. In many medieval communities, up to half of all children never reached adulthood. Losing a child wasn't rare, it was expected. Some families had 10 kids just to make sure a few survived. So when night finally comes and you lie down in your flea-filled bed, you don't just hope for sleep. You hope nobody in your house wakes up sick, because you're definitely not ready for the next problem. Tomorrow morning, you'll go back to the fields, not because you want to, because you have to. In medieval Europe, most peasants lived under a system called feudalism. The land belongs to a lord. The lord allows you to live on it. In return, you work his land and give him a share of everything you produce. Miss those payments, and things get ugly fast. A steward might show up to seize your grain. Sometimes they take your animals. Sometimes they take your tools, or even parts of your house. Punishments can be public. People were fined, beaten, or locked in stocks where neighbors could throw mud and garbage at them. And leaving the land isn't easy either. Many peasants were serfs, meaning they were legally tied to the land they worked. Moving away without permission could make you a criminal. So no matter how hard the work is or how little food you have, there's no easy way out. You wake up, you work, you pay the Lord, and hope nothing worse happens. Unfortunately, something worse was always waiting. You wake up one morning and the village is quiet. Too quiet. Someone down the road has a fever. Another neighbor has strange black swellings under their arms. By evening, the church bell starts ringing again and again and again. This is the Black Death. And once it enters the village, things move fast. The disease spreads through fleas on rats, which are absolutely everywhere in medieval towns. Within a few days, people develop massive swollen lumps called buboes on their neck, groin, or armpits. They burn with fever, cough blood, and sometimes die within 3 days. Doctors can't help much. Most medieval medicine involves prayer, herbs, or bleeding the patient, which mostly just makes the dying person weaker. So families do what they can. Some flee, some lock themselves inside. Others abandon sick relatives entirely because they know what's coming next. Mass graves. During the worst years of the Black Death in the 1300s, entire villages disappeared. In parts of Europe, 1/3 to half the population died. And if you're a peasant, you don't get to escape to a distant castle. You stay right where you are, waiting to see if the next body carried to the churchyard will be someone you know. Even if the plague doesn't kill you, something else might. War. Medieval wars weren't fought neatly on battlefields. Armies marched directly through farmland, which meant villages like yours were often the first thing they found. And the soldiers were hungry. If an army arrives, they take what they want. Grain, animals, tools, firewood. Sometimes the entire harvest disappears in a single afternoon. If peasants resist, the results can be brutal. Houses are burned, crops destroyed, livestock slaughtered. Sometimes the entire village is looted just to punish the enemy who supposedly owns the land. For soldiers, this is strategy. Destroy the farms and the enemy starves. For peasants, it means watching a year of back-breaking work vanish in a few hours. And once the army moves on, you're left standing in a field of ash with winter still coming, which leads to the most common danger of all. Sometimes the weather simply decides you're not eating this year. One cold spring, one summer of endless rain, or one swarm of insects can wipe out the crops your entire village depends on. When that happens, things get ugly very quickly. First, the grain runs out. Then people start stretching what little food they have. Bread gets thinner, soups get weaker. Soon, you're boiling whatever grows nearby. Grass, nettles, tree bark. Historical records from medieval famines describe people mixing ground acorns, roots, and even straw into flour just to make something that looked like bread. And when that runs out too, people begin eating animals they normally wouldn't touch. Dogs, cats, sometimes rats. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, years of relentless rain destroyed crops across northern Europe. Grain prices skyrocketed, and millions of peasants slowly starved. Some reports from the time describe people collapsing in roads and fields because their bodies simply ran out of energy. And winter was still months away. But even famine wasn't the only thing waiting at the end of your life as a peasant, because eventually everyone ended up in the same place. If you somehow survived the hunger, the disease, the taxes, and the wars, there's one final reality of medieval life. You probably won't live very long. Average life expectancy in the Middle Ages was roughly 30 to 35 years. That number is dragged down heavily by child deaths, but even adults rarely reached what we'd consider old age today. Infections were everywhere. A small cut from farm work could turn septic. A fever could kill you within days. Childbirth alone was one of the most dangerous events in a woman's life. And when death came, it came quickly. Funerals were simple. A priest, a few prayers, and a grave dug near the church. The next day, the village kept working. Fields still needed plowing, crops still needed planting. Life moved on because it had to. Which means, for most medieval peasants, the entire story of their life looks something like this. Born poor, worked constantly, buried early. And tomorrow morning, the bell rings again. One day you get into an argument with a neighbor. Maybe it's about a cow wandering into the wrong field. Maybe someone accuses you of stealing grain. Either way, the village court called. And this is where things get interesting. Because medieval justice is not exactly what we'd call fair. If there's no clear proof, the court might decide the truth using something called an ordeal, which basically means letting God decide. One common method is the ordeal by hot iron. You carry a red-hot piece of metal across the church floor while everyone watches. Then your hand is wrapped in a cloth and checked a few days later. If the wounds heal cleanly, congratulations, God says you're innocent. If it's infected or blistered, well, clearly God disagrees. Other ordeals involve plunging your arm into boiling water or being tied up and thrown into a river. If you floated, you were guilty. If you sank, you were innocent. Which sounds fair until you realize innocent people tended to drown. And remember, you're a peasant, which means even if you win the case, you still owe the Lord your taxes tomorrow. Eventually, the sun goes down. Your body hurts, your hands are blistered, you've eaten just enough to stay alive. So you lie down in your straw bed again, listening to the animals outside and the wind pushing through the walls. Tomorrow, the same routine begins. Wake up before sunrise, work until dark, give away most of what you grow, and hope the next year isn't worse than the last. Because for medieval peasants, life wasn't a heroic adventure or a grand story. It was survival, one long day after another. So when we imagine the Middle Ages, we usually picture castles, knights, and kings. But the reality is that most people lived very different lives. They woke up hungry, worked until their bodies broke, and faced constant threats from disease, famine, war, and the people who ruled them. For millions of peasants, history was about making it through one more day. And if you think your Monday mornings are rough, just be grateful you're not waking up in a medieval village.